As an African-American mother, head of household, and educator in Atlanta, it seems like we are always on the bottom step, pushing like our lives and our children's lives depend on it. But I'm looking up because our ancestors, foremothers, and forefathers left us roadmaps, blueprints, and codes to crack so that we learn from past mistakes and move this nation forward. So today, we get to take out our composition notebooks and get to work. Dr. Kamau Bobb is a champion in the national effort to achieve equity in the STEM education landscape. He currently serves as a program officer at the National Science Foundation in the Directorate for Computer and Information Science and Engineering. There, he is helping to shape the national research agenda for effective means of delivering quality computational education to all students. So I'd like to introduce to you all Dr. Kamau Bobb.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. It's always challenging to follow brothers with these big booming voices. But Nisha and Andrea, the work that's going on here is clearly critical and timely. I want to frame what we're discussing essentially as a message to y'all. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is to make education something that is meaningful, that's valuable, and can contribute to the larger national dialogue. And y'all are in school. I'm assuming you're missing school today. I don't know how you worked that out. But that was some nice work. But here's what I'd like to do. The things that Nisha laid out before, those statistics about school performance, to some extent, we got to be careful about that, particularly when we're presenting data like that to students. Because this stereotype threat that's out there is real. So what that means is that when you are concerned about your own performance and the expectation is that the group that you are a part of doesn't achieve, you can begin to believe that. And so ultimately, the bombarding of these negative statistics can be dangerous. But they are also, we run a fine line because they're also necessary for us to understand what the problem actually is. So rather than go through more of those data that demonstrate how bifurcated our system is, I want to discuss the way I view the central part of the problem. But I wanted to just make a little personal pitch for what I think the problem actually is. So in so doing, if you'd bear with me, I think to do this, we need a little bit of truth serum. And the brother earlier brought up James Baldwin. In the private chambers of the soul, the guilty party is identified. And the accusing finger there is not legend, but consequence. Not fantasy, but the truth. And the truth doesn't really care about your feelings. When President Trump was in his campaign mode, if you all will remember, there was a period of time during those campaign rallies where there was a lot of violence exacted on people of color. There was one in particular, it just so happened that my daughter and I were watching the news just as it was happening, and there was a sister at one of these rallies, and these white men gathered around her and they beat her up. And she, as children often do, looked to me and said, just to me as an adult, not me personally, but said, "Do I have to be afraid if he becomes president?" And I think in that, we see the challenge that we're currently in. I think the measurement of the dream, it supposes that the dream was for citizenship, that we could all be citizens of the country. And irrespective of what that might mean in legal terms, think about what it means in human terms. That our presence in this country is, to some extent, a privilege. We were born here for various reasons, I get it. But the function of being a citizen is such that you can contribute to the greater good of the society, such that our existence is mutually dependent on each other. We have a collective responsibility towards one another to solve our larger problems, to recognize our weaknesses and strengths, and to be part of the process of improvement. In my view, that's what citizenship is about. But you need tools to be able to do that. That's where education comes in. So the way that this little schema works is, I've already said, I think that education and citizenship are the two paramount paths towards a more effective and robust country. The extent to which that segregation on the bottom of that ratio is large, it undermines the value of the denominator. If you have this enormous numerator, the value of the ratio goes down. So ultimately, if you think about it, the extent to which segregation exists, it undermines the way that our education works, and ultimately, it decreases the value of citizenship, because we have two separate systems, and they don't work together. They cannot, they won't, they haven't. There's evidence all over the place. So here's where the education thing becomes tricky. So that red square says that only 13% of black students in Georgia are proficient in math in the 8th grade. 1-3, which means that 87% are not. At Georgia Tech, we don't even offer pre-calculus. So if you don't have that in high school, you can't even come. At the National Science Foundation, we're playing with the most elite schools. If you want to go to Berkeley, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, all these kinds of schools, if you don't have basic math proficiency in the 8th grade, you're not done, but the likelihood of your being successful at any of those kinds of institutions is slim. Slim. And I am not one to disparage second chances and making sure that you can win regardless, but we have to face the facts of what is true. If we're thinking about post-secondary education, we have a system that's set up based on the fact that these skills are not going equally across our segregated society. So this comes from the Center for Education and the Workforce, Anthony Carnevale, and what he does is he makes, over the last 20 years, it's basically from 1995 to 2008, I think, the college post-secondary educational enrollments almost doubled. So this is an assessment of the new set of enrolled students, how they split between the 468 highly select institutions and the open access kind of community colleges. So what you'll find in this very simple graph is that basically almost all of the new college enrollees in that period of time who went to the 468 highly select institutions in the United States were white. And almost all of the black new enrollees and Hispanic enrollees that went to the open access schools were black and Hispanic. And open access schools, as we all know, I ran the STEM initiative for the University System of Georgia. Those schools are under-resourced. The faculty there are trying their best with worn-out tools. But when you come to places like Georgia Tech, who has an upwards of $700 million annual research budget, the lives are different. And what does this do? Going to places like Tech opens doors for you. Here I am. The door was opened for me. They gave me a badge, and here I am speaking. And it's not to say that if you don't go to those schools, the doors are not open, but believe. Here, too, is where you know the truth. You just know it. Whether you actually see the data or not, you know that if you don't go to one of these elite schools, the road is more difficult for you. There's some black box that says, for this particular students who don't have any light, I'm going to give them some kind of special light. They'll see it, then they're going to be happy. But all of it is addressing symptoms. The symptoms are of this problem. That's the issue. And how we address that is a much bigger problem. So we can have our educational discourse, and I think the measurement of the dream ultimately is the extent to which we can accept the idea of what complete citizenship looks like. The programs that we need to be involved in have to revolve around civic responsibility, citizenship. We can teach you all day. We have innumerable examples of things that are successful. But what we're not addressing is the segregation itself that causes these problems. And the point that Cherie raised earlier is that if you're born poor in Atlanta, the likelihood that you die poor is through the roof. It's also one of the most immutable places in the country. That is a measurement and a failure of the dream here, where the dream was born. Truth. So my charge and challenge is that education and citizenship are the two pillars of how we're going to exist. One is a prerequisite for the other. The way that we address education has to be with the objective of citizenship. That's the point. That's the objective. That's why we're doing it. I don't buy in, let me rephrase just to make sure that I drive the point home. I don't buy into the point that education is, the objective of education is to get a job. That's not it. By way of having a robust education, you will be employed. You will be engaged. But the point is to make the country better. I'll finish with the idea that with President Obama's last address, his charge to us was to question our citizenship. What are the characteristics that make us better citizens? And that's the question I would leave with you all. Thanks. So here's where I do think that the measurement of students' performance matters. So if we're trying to determine what are the variables that we can in fact change, I think this larger goal that I'm raising about citizenship and so on is really important. But what we can do is make sure that the expectations for students in the circumstances that they're in match our belief in their abilities. And that's a teaching modality. Right. So I think in several of these programs that we have that are effective, the charter school movement itself is kind of one that tries to embody that. But the point there is that if we can separate the larger goal with the incremental steps, because often, as you probably know, the individual schools that work well, I always like to use Jeffrey Canada at the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. So people herald that as this, for those of you who don't know this, it's a school called Harlem Children's Zone, and it's a very complete system of education. So it deals with the communities, the students' parents, the presumption that the whole community is a learning modality. If you've ever seen or met or listened to him, he's a force of nature. So you can't replicate him. But the models are there. So in answer to your question, I think that if we separate the performance modules from the larger goal, there are certainly things that we could do along the way.
So I was actually remembering the report that Southern Education Foundation released in 2015, where they indicated that for the first time in public schools, more than half of the students came from families that would be classified as low-income families or low-income households. So where does poverty factor in?
Well, that report, Kent McGuire is the head of the Southern Education Foundation, and when that report came out, one of the things that struck me about it was, in a discussion with him, he framed that as a concentration of color and poverty in public schools. It's part of a national trend, as you said. And then, coincident with that, there's a brother, Sean Harper. He used to be at UPenn, now he's at UCLA. He had this expulsion report where he talked about the rates at which black and brown kids are expelled from schools. And there's certain counties in the South, particularly in Georgia, where 100% of all the kids who are expelled are black. So think about the duality of those things. It's a concentration of black and brown students, some of whom and a lot of whom are poor, are in public schools. At the same time, the response of the school system itself is to ramp up its punitive aggression. Again, this segregation idea comes in. the system's view of these kids is dominated by the presumption of their criminality as opposed to the presumption of their abilities. And that's where, if we're thinking about what the implications of that are, the way that you change that is that you lead with ambition and expectations that are high. And then punitive measures will come in accordance with what they ought to be. Children always have infractions. But if you criminalize and demonize somebody by just going and putting a metal detector up front and making sure they have to have a transparent backpack or don't allow them to have a backpack at all, that's the whole handbook when you first get there on the first day of school. You're like, yo, I'm coming to school, I'm coming to jail, where am I coming? So there, I think the way that we've built the systems, and I'm not saying that the students have no responsibility in this, but the way we've built the system is to criminalize and extend to these communities of people right at the outset that they're criminals. And if you're asking a 12-year-old to exist and resist that identification of themselves when they may not have others who can help them do it, they'll buy into it.
And this last question, I think, again, and this is important, and you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but how do we reframe the narrative so that we stop blaming victims of failed educational opportunities?
So here's where I think when we're trying to retool what educational programs actually are, this is where the importance of human interaction, the relationship between the continuity of literature and the spoken word of who we are as people, is as important as making sure that you have computational skills to get a job in the tech sector and what have you. There's a lofty part of this, which is the realization of citizenship through education. Undergirded in that is how we operate as human beings in a city. Second to that is the measurements that we actually have to do. So the manifestation, for example, in health, the manifestations of these things in prison issues, the manifestation in transportation, in the Beltline, all of that. So all of those things to me are rooted in the central issue of the extent to which we see each other as people. Until we really address that, all of these other things that we're doing, the patterns in these data that Nisha showed us, are demonstrating the fact that we haven't changed that. That's why those patterns are so persistent, so lasting, and they just haven't changed.